Welcome to Archive Vault, where we explore declassified records, hidden histories, and state-level investigations. Please note, some illustrative narration is AI-generated for storytelling purposes. All content is educational and documentary-based. The story does not begin with a haunting. It begins with authority. In post-war America, fear was not only tolerated, it was organized, named, and given uniforms. The Cold War reshaped how Americans understood threats they could not see: nuclear radiation, communism, psychological warfare. And beneath it all, a quieter anxiety lingered: the idea that evil was not abstract, but personal, present in homes, objects, and people. Into this landscape stepped Ed and Lorraine Warren. Edward Warren Miney was born in 1926 in Bridgeport, Connecticut, a working-class city shaped by factories, Catholic parishes, and post-war industrial life. According to his own later accounts, his childhood home was haunted. He would describe footsteps, moving objects, and unexplained sounds. Experiences, he said, marked him early and permanently. There is no independent record of these events, but the story became foundational. It framed Ed Warren not as a man who chose the paranormal, but as someone chosen by it. Lorraine Rita Moran was born a year later in 1927. She would later describe herself as clairvoyant from childhood, claiming she could see lights, auras, and spiritual impressions around people and places. These abilities, she said, were not learned. They were inherent. Like Ed, Lorraine's account was self-reported, and like Ed, it would become central to the authority she later claimed. They met as teenagers, married young, and settled into a partnership that blurred the lines between marriage, ministry, and investigation. Ed painted houses to support them. Lorraine worked quietly beside him. By the early 1950s, they were presenting themselves publicly, not just as curious observers, but as investigators of the supernatural. In 1952, they founded the New England Society for Psychic Research, NESPR. The name carried weight. Society suggested structure. Research implied method. Yet NESPR was not affiliated with any academic institution, university, or scientific body. It had no peer review process, no standardized investigative protocols, and no external oversight. Its authority came entirely from the Warrens themselves. This distinction mattered, but it was rarely questioned. Ed Warren identified himself as a demonologist, not a priest, not a theologian, not a psychologist, a demonologist. The term had no licensing body, no governing board, and no formal credentialing process. Ed acknowledged this openly. He argued that demonology was not an academic discipline, but a calling, one rooted in experience, faith, and exposure to evil rather than study alone. Lorraine Warren positioned herself as the instrument. Ed interpreted. Lorraine perceived. She claimed to psychically read locations, objects, and people, describing emotional imprints and spiritual residue. Together, they presented a complete system. The unseen detected, then explained. Crucially, they framed their work within Catholic doctrine. This was not incidental. Catholicism provided structure, hierarchy, and legitimacy. The Warrens did not describe themselves as occultists or spiritualists. They rejected seances as entertainment and distanced themselves from fortune tellers. They spoke the language of sin, demons, and salvation. Evil, they said, was real, but it was also categorized, named, and subject to spiritual law. This framing mattered in 1950s and 1960s America. Protestant skepticism towards psychic phenomena coexisted with Catholic openness to possession, exorcism, and spiritual warfare. The Warrens positioned themselves inside that tradition, even though neither was ordained and neither represented the church officially. Their earliest investigations were local: private homes, small disturbances, objects believed to be cursed. They documented cases through photographs, audio recordings, sketches, and personal notes. Some of these materials would later be displayed in their home-based occult museum, a space they described as containment, not exhibition. Over time, a pattern emerged. Families experiencing distress, emotional, financial, psychological, would contact the Warrens. The Warrens would arrive, listen, document, and interpret. In many cases, they would advise clergy involvement. In others, they would recommend spiritual cleansing or removal of objects. Rarely did they stay long. Their role was diagnostic, not therapeutic. By the 1960s, Ed Warren was lecturing across the United States. Churches, colleges, civic halls. He brought photographs, audio recordings, stories. Lorraine would often sit beside him, silent, observing. Their presentations were not theatrical in the modern sense, but they were compelling. They offered audiences something concrete, names for fear. What they did not offer was replication. No case could be independently reproduced. No phenomenon could be summoned on demand. Evidence was experiential, not experimental. The Warrens did not see this as a weakness. They argued that evil, by nature, resisted observation. Demons, they said, did not perform for skeptics. This position placed them beyond verification and beyond disproof. By the early 1970s, the Warrens had investigated hundreds of cases. They claimed thousands. The exact number was never documented, but the figure itself became part of the mythology. It suggested scale, reach, expertise accumulated over time. And then came Amityville. In 1974, Ronald DeFeo Jr. murdered 6 members of his family in Amityville, New York. The crime was real, documented, and brutal. A year later, the Lutz family moved into the house and fled after 28 days, reporting terrifying experiences. The Warrens were called in. They conducted an investigation, a seance. Photographs were taken, stories were told. Amityville transformed the Warrens from regional figures into national authorities. A book followed, then a film. The case became inseparable from their names. From that moment on, the Warrens were no longer just investigators. They were gatekeepers to a genre. Fame brought access. Access brought control. Families who contacted the Warrens often signed agreements that limited who else could investigate. Writers, not journalists, were brought in to tell the stories. The narrative moved outward. Books, lectures, documentaries, while the raw materials remained private. The occult museum grew. Annabelle the doll, ritual objects, items the Warrens claimed were dangerous. Each artifact reinforced the same message. Evil was not theoretical. It was stored, cataloged, and locked away. By the late 1970s, Ed and Lorraine Warren occupied a unique position. They were cited by believers and skeptics alike. They were criticized but rarely ignored. They operated outside institutions while borrowing their authority. They were independent, yet deeply embedded in a cultural moment hungry for meaning. They did not ask to be believed, they said. They asked to be taken seriously. And for decades they were. Part 1 ends here, not with a judgment, but with a foundation. 2 individuals, a self-created institution, a system of belief framed as investigation, a public ready to listen. What follows are the cases that built the legend and the mechanisms that protected it. By the time Ed and Lorraine Warren entered the 1970s, their identities were already fixed. They were not hobbyists. They were not entertainers. They were specialists in evil. What changed was scale. The United States was entering a period of deep cultural fracture. Trust in institutions was eroding. Vietnam, Watergate, rising crime, and the collapse of social certainty created a population increasingly receptive to unseen explanations. Fear no longer needed to be distant. It could live in a basement, a bedroom, a child's toy. The Warrens did not create this atmosphere. They understood it. Their most influential cases followed a pattern. Ordinary families, extraordinary claims, limited access, and a narrative controlled from the outset. The Annabelle case. In 1970, a nursing student reported strange activity involving a Raggedy Ann doll. The doll allegedly moved on its own, appeared in different rooms, and left handwritten notes. A psychic medium claimed the spirit of a deceased child was attached to it. The Warrens rejected that explanation. They asserted the entity was not a child at all, but a non-human presence using deception. This distinction became central to their worldview. Spirits that appeared benign were often the most dangerous. According to their account, the doll exhibited aggression toward a visitor. The Warrens removed it and placed it in their occult museum, sealing it in a glass case blessed by clergy. There was no police report, no independent forensic analysis. The object itself became the evidence. Annabelle introduced a key Warren principle: containment over confrontation. Some objects, they claimed, could not be cleansed, only isolated. The Perron family haunting. In 1971, the Perron family moved into a farmhouse in Harrisville, Rhode Island. They soon reported apparitions, physical disturbances, and emotional torment. The Warrens were called to investigate. Lorraine Warren later described sensing a powerful female spirit tied to the land. The name Bathsheba Sherman emerged, an alleged 19th century woman accused, in Warren accounts, of witchcraft and infanticide. Historical records confirm Bathsheba Sherman existed. They do not confirm the crimes attributed to her. The Warrens attempted a seance during the investigation. According to their account, the event escalated violently and was terminated. The family ultimately asked the Warrens to leave, yet the case became one of their most famous. This pattern repeated often: limited involvement, lasting ownership of the narrative. The Amityville case marked a turning point. The Warrens did not discover the story. They entered it after the murders, after the Lutz family's claims began circulating. Their investigation was brief but decisive. They labeled the house a site of demonic infestation. Photographs taken during the investigation, most famously an image said to show a childlike figure, were never independently authenticated. Audio recordings allegedly captured voices, but only excerpts were released. Still, Amityville spread rapidly. Books, films, and talk shows followed. The Warrens became media figures. Their authority was no longer local or religious, it was cultural. From this point forward, they were no longer reacting to cases. Cases came to them already shaped by expectation. The Smurl haunting. In the 1980s, the Smurl family in Pennsylvania reported years of escalating disturbances: foul odors, physical assaults, shadowy forms, and animalistic sounds. The Warrens identified multiple entities, including a powerful demon. Exorcisms were attempted, blessings performed. The activity reportedly continued. What made the Smurl case distinct was duration. Unlike earlier cases, the haunting did not resolve. The family eventually moved. This introduced a quiet contradiction. What happens when evil does not retreat? The Warrens did not reinterpret the case. They reaffirmed it. The Devil Made Me Do It case. In 1981, Arnie Cheyenne Johnson killed his landlord and later claimed demonic possession as the cause. The Warrens had previously been involved with Johnson's fiance's family, investigating what they described as a possession of a young boy. This case crossed a boundary. For the first time, Warren testimony entered a murder trial. Possession was raised as a defense. The court rejected it. The Warrens maintained their position. To them, legal systems were not equipped to recognize spiritual causation. This case established a dangerous precedent, belief extending beyond private experience into public consequence. The museum as archive. As cases multiplied, the Warrens' home transformed into a repository. The occult museum was not advertised as a curiosity collection. It was framed as a vault. Each object represented a closed case, a threat neutralized but not destroyed. Visitors were warned not to touch. Clergy blessed the room regularly. The museum functioned as evidence without examination. Presence replaced proof. By the end of the 1980s, Ed and Lorraine Warren had become something rare. Independent authorities whose credibility rested entirely on their own continuity. They cited their past to validate their present. Each case reinforced the last. They did not need institutions. They had a canon. Part 2 closes here, with the machinery in place. The cases established fear, The narratives preserved it. What remained was scrutiny and the systems that resisted it. By the time skepticism began to catch up, the structure was already set. Ed and Lorraine Warren did not operate in secrecy. They operated in plain sight, using a framework that made outside examination difficult without appearing hostile to faith, victims, or belief itself. Their authority did not come from proof. It came from positioning. They were not scientists, and they never claimed to be. This distinction insulated them. Scientific standards could be dismissed as inadequate for spiritual phenomena. Requests for controlled conditions were reframed as naive or spiritually blind. In this model, disbelief was not neutral. It was a liability. Access was tightly managed. Families who contacted the Warrens were often experiencing fear, instability, or isolation. Once involved, the Warrens frequently became the primary interpreters of events. Other investigators were discouraged or excluded. In some cases, agreements were signed that restricted media access or alternative explanations. This ensured narrative consistency while limiting contradiction. Writers, not journalists, were brought in to tell the stories. Gerald Brittle's The Demonologist did not investigate the Warrens. It presented them. The book was framed as nonfiction, but written in a narrative style that prioritized emotional continuity over verification. Once published, it became a source that future accounts referenced, creating a closed loop of citation. The Warrens cited Brittle. Brittle cited the Warrens. Photographs and recordings followed a similar pattern. Images were released without originals. Audio was excerpted without full context. Metadata was unavailable. When questioned, the explanation was always the same. Demonic forces interfere with technology. Evidence degrades in the presence of evil. This claim was impossible to disprove and unnecessary to prove. Criticism did exist. Investigators like Joe Nickell and organizations such as the Skeptical Inquirer examined Warren cases and found inconsistencies, historical inaccuracies, and alternative explanations rooted in psychology, folklore, or misinterpretation. In response, the Warrens did not engage point by point. They reframed skepticism as spiritual ignorance. This reframing was powerful. To doubt the Warrens was not merely to doubt a story. It was to side with denial in the face of evil. Skeptics were not challengers. They were obstacles. This narrative discouraged public debate while reinforcing loyalty among believers. The Catholic Church, often assumed to have endorsed the Warrens, maintained distance. While individual priests cooperated, the Church never formally sanctioned Ed Warren as a demonologist, nor Lorraine Warren as a medium. Exorcisms referenced in Warren accounts were typically minor rites or blessings, not official Roman exorcisms authorized by a bishop. This distinction was rarely emphasized publicly. The Warrens existed in a liminal space, adjacent to authority but not bound by it. As their reputation grew, so did their immunity. Television appearances, lecture tours, and best-selling books elevated them beyond local critique. By the time serious allegations or contradictions surfaced, the narrative was already cultural property. The system did not require everyone to believe. It required that doubt remain fragmented. The Occult Museum embodied this philosophy. Objects were dangerous, viewers were warned, and access was limited. There was no chain of custody, no provenance review, no external cataloging. The artifact's power was asserted, not demonstrated. The museum functioned less as a collection and more as a symbol, proof that the Warrens had seen things others had not survived. This symbolic authority carried into later years. When films adapted Warren cases, the Warrens were consulted. Their portrayal was heroic, restrained, moral. Fiction reinforced biography, and biography lent weight to fiction. A feedback loop formed in which storytelling validated belief and belief sustained storytelling. By the time Ed Warren died in 2006, the system was complete. Lorraine continued alone, quieter but unwavering, guarding both the objects and the legacy. Criticism intensified in later years, including allegations about Ed Warren's personal conduct, and questions about the ethical boundaries of their work. But these revelations came after canonization. Part 3 ends with the question left unanswered. If authority is constructed through access, belief, and repetition, what happens when the archive itself resists examination? The answer lies not in disproving the phenomena, but in understanding the moment that made the Warrens possible. The Warrens did not rise in a vacuum. They rose in a country already prepared to listen. From the late 1960s through the 1980s, America experienced what would later be called the Satanic Panic, a diffuse cultural fear that hidden networks of evil were operating beneath ordinary life. It was not driven by a single event, but by convergence. Sensational crime reporting, evangelical revivalism, talk show culture, and a growing fascination with psychological vulnerability. In this environment, the Warrens' work did not appear extreme. It appeared explanatory. Possession narratives offered a framework for behaviors that felt frightening and uncontrollable. Childhood trauma, dissociation, addiction, depression, and violence could be reframed as external invasion rather than internal collapse. This reframing did not originate with the Warrens, but they gave it structure, vocabulary, and visual language. They spoke in categories: infestation, oppression, possession. These terms suggested escalation, diagnosis, and response. They transformed fear into a process. For families experiencing distress, this was stabilizing. Something was wrong, but it had a name. It had rules, and someone knew how to confront it. Media amplified this effect. Daytime television blurred the line between testimony and entertainment. Hosts rarely challenged guests. Emotional credibility mattered more than corroboration. When Ed and Lorraine Warren appeared, they did so calmly without spectacle. This contrast worked in their favor. They were not shouting. They were warning. At the same time, popular culture was reshaping horror itself. Films like The Exorcist did not invent possession. They normalized it. What once belonged to theology became cinematic reality. Viewers arrived already primed to accept that evil could enter through children, objects, or homes. The Warrens positioned themselves as the sober counterpart to fiction. They insisted their cases were worse than the movies, precisely because they were real. Critically, this period also saw growing mistrust of institutions meant to protect. Police failed, courts disappointed, churches fractured. Psychiatry was both expanding and being questioned. In that gap, alternative authorities flourished. The Warrens filled that gap without challenging power directly. They did not attack the church. They did not reject medicine outright. They simply claimed jurisdiction over what others could not explain. This allowed them to move freely. When critics pointed to psychological explanations, the Warrens acknowledged them, but only as partial truths. Trauma, they argued, created vulnerability. Evil exploited it. This synthesis made their framework adaptable. Any contradiction could be absorbed rather than disproven. By the 1980s, the consequences became visible. Daycare abuse allegations spread nationwide, often without evidence. Recovered memory therapy gained traction. Accusations multiplied. Lives were ruined, and later investigations found no corroboration in many cases. The Warrens were not architects of these movements, but their work existed within the same logic. Unseen forces, hidden networks, absolute moral stakes. They rarely commented publicly on these excesses. Silence preserved alignment without responsibility. As their cases entered film, the Warrens' image shifted again. They became protectors rather than investigators. Fiction erased ambiguity. Failures vanished. Doubt was edited out. What remained was a moral clarity that real life never provided. This cinematic legacy outlived the moment that created it. By the time public skepticism regained footing in the 1990s and 2000s, the cultural damage and fascination had already been done. Belief systems had hardened. Stories had become inheritance. Questioning them felt like erasure rather than inquiry. The Warrens had become symbols. Symbols are difficult to examine because they are no longer about facts alone. They carry identity, memory, and meaning. To challenge them feels personal. Part 4 ends here, with context, not verdict, a society in flux, fear seeking structure, authority emerging where certainty failed. What remains is not whether the Warrens believe their own stories, but what survives when belief meets record. That separation comes last. When the archive is finally opened, what matters is not belief, but trace. Ed and Lorraine Warren claimed thousands of cases. Fewer than a fraction are documented in primary form. Of those, most rely on testimony recorded years after the events, filtered through books, lectures, and adaptations. Original field notes are not publicly available. Raw audio and photographic materials remain privately held or selectively released. No case file has been subjected to independent forensic review from start to finish. This does not mean nothing happened. It means the record is incomplete. In the most famous cases, key elements dissolve under examination. Historical research does not support the crimes attributed to Bathsheba Sherman. The Annabelle case has no contemporaneous medical or legal documentation of injury. The Amityville narrative contains contradictions acknowledged even by those initially involved. Courts rejected possession as a legal defense in the Arn Johnson case, not on theological grounds, but due to lack of admissible evidence. These outcomes are not refutations of experience. They are boundaries of proof. Psychology offers explanations for many reported phenomena: sleep paralysis, suggestion, confirmation bias, dissociation, and stress-induced perception. Environmental factors, carbon monoxide, infrasound, structural noise, have been documented in similar cases. None of these explanations require deception. They require context. The Warrens rejected these frameworks not because they were implausible, but because they were insufficient for the meaning people sought. Their work operated at the level of narrative coherence rather than empirical resolution. That distinction explains both their power and their limitation. The Catholic Church never canonized their methods. Skeptical investigators never accepted their conclusions. Yet the Warrens persisted because they occupied a space neither institution fully controlled. They were translators of fear in an era that lacked shared language for it. The most enduring artifact of the Warren legacy is not a doll, a house, or a case file. It is the structure they modeled: private authority, narrative ownership, and moral certainty insulated from verification. That structure did not begin with them, and it did not end with them. Their influence is visible in modern paranormal media, true crime storytelling, and online belief systems that prioritize testimony over testing. The pattern repeats: limited access, emotional credibility, resistance to falsification, and endurance through repetition. This does not make the Warrens villains. It does not make them heroes. It places them where archives often do, at the intersection of belief and need. Ed Warren died in 2006, Lorraine Warren in 2019. What remains is not their certainty, but the questions their certainty postponed. How fear becomes form, how authority is assembled, how stories outlive their tellers. In the end, the archive does not ask whether demons exist. It asks something quieter and more difficult. What happens when explanation feels safer than uncertainty? That is the residue left behind, and that is what survives. Thank you for listening to Archive Vault Podcasts. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive and found it insightful. Wishing you a great week ahead, and remember to subscribe so you don't miss our next episode. We'll be back soon with more stories from the archives. See you next time.